Okay, so my presentation is addressing the issue of, we're all, I think, generally aware that there are systemic issues and issues with First Nations. And so I've started giving this presentation based on a case I've been involved with for several years, but it's opened my eyes quite significantly to issues that I don't think that we discuss enough. So this is what my presentation is on. So what's holding First Nations back? All right, so this is a quote from the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People, who wrote that the human rights problems faced by Indigenous people in Canada have reached a crisis proportion. The most jarring manifestation of these human rights problems is the distressing socio-economic conditions of Indigenous peoples in a highly developed country. So I think we're all somewhat aware of that problem, that poverty on First Nations communities is fairly extensive in Canada. There are some pretty sobering statistics. Only a small portion of them I've included up on my slide, but it's known that 1 in 4 of every First Nations children live in poverty. In terms of social development and social assistance, a massive amount of First Nations people living in First Nations communities are on social assistance, 33.6%, and in some places you can get as high as a population, about 80% of the population of a community might be on social assistance. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the Auditor General of Canada and other authorities and the Department of Aboriginal Affairs itself has recognized that overall social assistance on reserve is not comparable to what people in the provinces receive. Other statistics, there are 3 times more First Nations children in foster care than there were at the time when First Nations children were taken into residential schools. There's more kids today in foster care than there were kids in residential schools at the time that those schools were at their height. In addition, other statistics have found that about 22% that First Nations children receive on average 22% less funding than children in the non-Aboriginal child welfare system. That means in the provinces. Graduation rates are lower. A statistic found that Canada spends about $6,500 per student on reserve versus $10,500 per student on reserve. There's a severe housing crisis that you will find on reserves as well. About 41.5% of homes on reserve require major repair. There's overcrowding. And just overall, there's not access to the same level of services that are available off reserve. So we know some of this stuff. We hear it in the news. But do we ever talk about what causes this, right? So what's the cause? Let's talk about what I think are actually some of the 2 major causes of this that don't get enough attention. Inadequate funding of First Nations programs and services, and what I will call legislative neglect, which is a lack of effective legal frameworks on reserves. So I'm going to take you through these 2 causes. This is a quote I heard Cindy Blackstock say. She's a PhD, she's a doctor, Dr. Cindy Blackstock. She's the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Services. And she's involved in a lawsuit, or a Canadian human rights complaint, since 2007, which is about child welfare services available on reserve. It's kind of going back to those statistics about there being so many kids in care. And what she argues is that a big part of that is the underfunding of services on reserve. And she made this statement in the context of that, saying discrimination is when a government doesn't think you're worth the money spending on. And as we'll see, there's some of that going on for sure. So let me give you a little overview of the situation that exists on First Nations reserves. There's about over 600 First Nations communities in Canada, representing an on-reserve population in excess of about 300,000 people. You know this from your studies, that the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction through Section 9124 of the Constitution Act, 1867. It has primarily legislatively been expressed through the Indian Act, which is a piece of legislation that's still with us. It was passed in 1876, and even before that there was legislation that the federal government passed with respect to First Nations people. Outside of the Indian Act, there really hasn't been much more legislatively the Government of Canada has done. There's been a handful of federal laws that have been passed in the last 15 years or so, and the vast majority of them are about land and money and taxation issues on reserve. It is a very common misconception that the Indian Act, you'll hear this if you do any sort of work in the area, people in community say this too, the Indian Act is cradle to grave legislation. And in some respects, I mean, there's actually provisions in the Indian Act about estates and wills, but in many ways, there's a lot of gaps. And really it only covers about 6 or 7 issues. And these would be Indian registration and band membership rules, Indians' collective interest in reserve lands. Oh, and I'll just say a little point as an offside. I'm going to use the term Indian because we're talking about the Indian Act, but my preference when sort of talking about the 50-plus nations that kind of, unfortunately, I'll get lumped into this concept of First Nation. That's the term we use now, but in the legislation it's often used as Indian. So I use that for the purposes of my discussion. However, the term that is preferred is First Nation. Okay, so, but moving on, I will use Indian in this presentation. And so there are rules in the Indian Act about the collective interest in reserve lands, how they can be transferred, leased, etc. I've mentioned that there's provisions on wills and estates. There's provisions about taxation and exemption from seizure of property on reserve. There's also sections on elections, and there's sections on bylaws that can be passed by First Nations. What is notably absent from the Indian Act are any laws about essential services. And what I mean when I say essential services, I mean about social assistance, child welfare, child care, health, education, policing, emergency services, housing. I mean, if you look to the provinces, you will find that there's a Social Assistance Act, there's a Child Welfare Act, there's a Child Care Act. All of these areas are extensively legislated, there's regulations on them, and then there's various policies that government employees in carrying out these various programs follow as well, which all goes back to their legislation. Canada, although it could legislate pursuant to its Section 9124 jurisdiction, has never legislated over this area. When it's been pushed on this, it just says, well, we don't have to really provide these services, even though they're basic essential services that, since about after World War II, every jurisdiction does provide these basic levels of services based on this idea of a social safety net. But they say we do this for good public policy reasons. But it really has no legal obligation to do so. That's what it says. Now, okay, so moving away from the from federal government for a moment, let's talk about the provinces. It gets into, and most of you are all second year in the room or going into second year, so you haven't done constitutional law yet and looking at the division of powers and these sorts of things. But what I will try to just summarize it as a real basic concept, although there's much more legal technicalities with this. But essentially, the provinces can legislate over services on reserve if they have legislation, what's called of general application. There are some areas where they can't, given constitutional doctrine. But for the most part, the provinces don't do so either. And generally that's because there's always this debate between the federal and provincial governments. So, the provinces say, well, you have legislative jurisdiction at 9124, it is your issue. Whereas the feds will say, well, you have this jurisdiction over providing all of these services more generally to people in the province, so it's your issue. And so what tends to happen is that, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but going back to the provinces, what tends to happen is that although their laws could apply more broadly, they don't. So what tends to happen is you'll see that provisions in social services legislation that has to do with prohibitions. For example, in child welfare legislation, there's provisions about, child abuse and neglect, and if it's found that children are in a situation such as that, they will be apprehended and taken into care. So those, since about the 1950s, have been extended on reserve. So that means that provincial legislation with respect to child welfare has been extended in terms of the burdens of the legislation. However, the provinces don't similarly extend their benefits of their legislation, such as providing programs and paying for that program, because they always take the position that it's the federal government who has that responsibility. So it's a very strange scenario. And this is how I liken it. It's a game of hot potato. No, they're your problem. No, they're your problem. They're not my problem. They're your problem. And so the status quo on reserve, given that sort of morass, is that essentially the federal government funds services, and it doesn't want to legislate, so it instead regulates through policy. So since about 1964, the federal government, this was after there was a report written by the Senate and the House of Commons that found that that First Nations people on reserve were not getting anywhere near the level of services of people in the province, and because this is when all of this legislation and programming was being developed. Anyway, we found that they didn't have access to those services, and somebody should do something about it. What the Senate and the House of Commons had recommended was the federal government and the provincial government working together to come up with, a sort of joint cost-sharing legislative scheme. Federal government went out and it actually made in law it possible that it could reach agreements with the provinces so that there would be the sharing of jurisdiction and cost sharing. Only one province, Ontario, accepted that agreement. There's a 1965 agreement between Ontario and the feds. But otherwise than that, none of the other provinces came on board. So I guess in the meantime, it started as a temporary policy, but it's been in place for over 50 years, or close to 50 years, is that the feds fund, it has got an authority to provide services on reserve, essential services, at rates and standards comparable to the provinces. And basically, this policy has been kind of interpreted by the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development in different ways at different times. So initially, in this region, I can say that what they did was, for example, for social assistance, they looked at the various manuals that existed in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI at the time, and they came up with one policy that set rates kind of as an amalgam of that, and that was what was applied on reserve. In the 90s, new policies were developed in each of the three provinces, and there was flexibility. In the 80s and 90s, what we see is that the government at this time was recognizing that First Nations should have more role in self-determining, in running their own programs, and also having some flexibility about what the terms and standards were. So in the 80s and in particularly the 90s, we see the government saying, you don't have to necessarily strictly follow provincial rules, you can adapt them, recognizing that there are quite substantial differences of circumstances on reserve and some different programs and these sorts of things. But more recently, this current administration has gone back to a very strict one, and so this involves one of the cases that I've been involved with. But that just suffices to say that that's how it works. It's being dealt with as a matter of policy and not so much as a matter of law. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. So at the end of the day, what happens on reserve is that through these policies, it's basically provincial laws by default. So the Government of Canada says that it funds services on reserve, and these days it funds services via transfer agreements with bands, and usually as a condition of them receiving those funds, it says that you have to follow provincial rules, right? So either provincial law either directly applies, or sometimes it applies by a policy. So that's where we're at these days, but it's starting to become, I think, quite apparent. If it should perhaps have been more apparent earlier, but that it really isn't acceptable to assume, if it ever was, that provincial standards are unquestionably adequate for the provision of services on reserve. So it's a very weird circumstance. So that provincial laws apply on reserve, but provincial governments don't really consult with or involve First Nations in their decision-making or policy-making. First Nations are not representative within provincial governments. A lot of First Nations don't even vote in provincial elections. And there's very little consultation or engagement with First Nations by the provinces. And why would there be when the person or the government who's funding it is an entirely different level of government? So it doesn't really make sense. So there's reasons to question why provincial policymakers would ever be even thinking about the context of what it's like to live on a reserve within the province, right? So, and I think it's, like I say, becoming more apparent that provincial laws just don't accommodate the different cultural and worldviews of First Nations. But even more so, I think, too, is this impact of systemic discrimination historically and current in colonialism. The stats that we started with, that, we're overrepresented in all of these different areas, we're disproportionately in jails, and the poverty that exists in communities. The provincial policymakers are not actually considering about how their rules impact on those policy issues. And it is quite apparent in the area of child welfare services of how inappropriate that's becoming. So you may have heard of this. You've heard of residential schools, I'm sure. You may have heard of the 60s scoop, which this is what occurred immediately after provincial welfare legislation started to be applied on reserves. Social workers would go in, they would see the conditions of poverty. People were affected also by residential schools, and that affected their parenting skills. But what that resulted in was a huge amount of children being apprehended through child welfare services and then being placed in foster homes and in permanent care off reserve. So there was a huge amount of children scooped up in that process. But that hasn't abated. That is actually still continuing today. In fact, Cindy Blackstock, the woman I spoke about earlier, says that we are at the highest level that we've ever been at in terms of the children being apprehended and kept in care. And it's through applying provincial legislation sort of in a wholesale sort of way without any recognition of the impacts of residential schools and day schools and the poverty. And recently the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report actually spoke to the need for policymakers to be aware of that when they're applying, legislation and policy on reserve. We're starting to see, and I think it extends beyond child welfare. I think applying the same standards that you apply, for example, in social assistance, that you would off reserve in the province, there's different circumstances on reserve. On reserve, people in some places, jobs are hard to get kind of generally in Atlantic Canada, and some provinces perhaps more than others, but certainly in an area like New Brunswick and parts of Nova Scotia, hard for anyone to get a job. But when you're dealing with systemic racism, issues of transportation, poverty, that just exacerbates it. And no one's thinking about those issues when they're just kind of blindly or wholesale applying provincial legislation, because provincial lawmakers are not thinking about it, and the feds just say, we'll just apply provincial law. So I use the term to call this sort of legislative neglect. No one is actually really thinking about the policy issues that affect First Nations. So there's a question, could First Nations people do this independently? You've heard the concept of self-government. And in fact, since 1995, there's been a policy by the Canadian government of recognizing the inherent self-government of Aboriginal people and saying that it's a protected right under Section 35. However, this same policy doesn't allow for First Nations to sort of independently or unilaterally exercise that right. It requires these negotiated agreements to occur. And these are occurring, and they've been kind of going on since the mid-70s, but they're extremely long and difficult to actually conclude. They're taking decades. So while in theory we recognize this right, the implementation of it is actually taking decades. And I think given the problems with the status quo, that's an issue. We can't just wait for 20 or 30 years from now for First Nations to be able to control issues that are occurring in their community. However, without these negotiated agreements, which negotiate not just legislative jurisdiction over areas, but also funding. Because funding is key, right? I mean, with these issues as well, many First Nations are poor. Some of them do have their own revenue that they make through economic development, but many communities still are quite challenged. And I mean, this is not an issue that only relates to First Nations people. The provinces get transfer payments from the federal government as well. All governments, there's this exchange of funding, certainly. So the provinces receive transfer payments, and so First Nation governments as well should receive transfer payments. So just to go back to my point, without sort of negotiated agreements of the type that are contemplated in that policy I referred to, it is a real challenge for First Nations to have the resources to really be able to create their own programs. They require funding for such, and that has to be negotiated with the government. So that puts a bit of a damper on First Nations being able to really exercise control in this area. So moving on to the second, so I've covered legislative neglect. Now I'm going to talk about inadequate funding, because the two go together, hand in hand. Okay? So in Canada, since about 1996, the federal government has put a 2% funding cap on spending for First Nations. So that means whenever they look at the budget every year, it cannot, despite the growth or the population of First Nations or inflation, there's been a cap put on funding for essential services at 2%. So education, child welfare, social assistance, and so this is resulting in certainly not enough funding being provided for First Nations. Significant annual decreases in bands budgets, basically. I mentioned earlier that the federal policy is to provide services comparable to what are provided off reserve. And the government of Canada takes the position that they're comparable, but First Nations have long argued that in fact what they are receiving is really not comparable. They're not receiving the full level and complement of services that people in the province receive. And I can say that from my involvement in a case I've been in for quite some time, it's about social assistance. Although the government says that it's providing the rates and levels of assistance that are provided in the provinces, they're only looking at a small, narrow sort of piece of that pie that the people in the provinces receive. They're looking simply at just the basic rates and supplementals, but they're not looking that in the province there are all these additional programs that are available that people on reserve are not receiving. So for example, in this case, one of the things we started working with the province of New Brunswick, looking at what they provide to people on social assistance. And they looked at our numbers and we looked at their numbers, and they said, boy, if the federal government actually wanted to provide the same level of services that we do, they would have to double the amount of funding that they're currently providing. Currently, there are also numerous complaints that have been made to the Canadian Human Rights Commission alleging that there is this inequality and inadequacy of funding. There's the child welfare case I've already referenced. There's also another one ongoing about education services on reserve, and also one about policing services on reserve. And you may remember even in the news a few months ago, there was that story about a house fire on a reserve that resulted in a child dying because the local fire department, who had been contracted by the band, and they said the band hadn't paid, so they hadn't come. And I mean, there's actually some evidence too that emergency services are not funded adequately. So all of that sort of plays into these awful things. In that case, the media blamed it on the band not paying their bills, but it's a far more complex issue. Okay, so and the Auditor General of Canada agrees with us on that. So there's various reports that the Auditor General has done looking at the services provided on reserve. So with respect to social assistance, the auditor's report said it's difficult for the department to ensure that eligible Indians living on reserve are receiving social assistance comparable with other recipients. On education, at present the department, this is the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, the department doesn't know whether the funding provided to First Nations is sufficient to meet the education standards it sets. So the department never actually really studies or sits down and looks at them, kind of assumes that it's providing, whatever it's providing is adequate. Child welfare, we found that INAC, that's the department, has not analyzed and compared the child welfare services available on reserve with those in neighboring communities off reserve. Emergency management. The department doesn't know if First Nations communities on reserve are receiving emergency services comparable to those available elsewhere. And it's the same for policing as well. Almost every area of essential services, you'll find this. So that's the inadequate funding piece. And so overall, what you get is a lack of a really adequate legal framework without the laws, without the funding. And we'll go back to, you recall that I say that basically the Department of Aboriginal Affairs regulates via policy. And now, I did say that they tend to apply provincial rules and standards, and that's problematic as well. but they don't legislate in that regard. So nobody really gets to oversee how they do that. And there's a lot of discretion, and probably none of you have taken administrative law yet, but decision makers get lots of discretion when the rules don't say exactly how they're supposed to do something. And there's a danger when you have, when a government employee has too much discretion, that there can be an abuse of discretion, meaning you can interpret something in a way that really ought not to be interpreted that way. And so there has been some recent examples of government employees, particularly with the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, kind of taking strange or very different and perhaps recognized harmful approaches to interpretations of their policy, and that has resulted in some court cases. One is the one that I've referenced that I've been involved with. Yeah, and so we find ourselves in court trying to argue that based on administrative law principles, the government shouldn't be interpreting its policies the way that it is. And there's something kind of wrong with that. I've written a paper on this. I know this is a weird drawing, but this is how I compare on reserve and off reserve. So so let's talk about off reserve. So the donuts represent the law, okay? The donuts represent the law. The law sets out standards that people who apply the law have to abide by, right? But we all recognize that people who apply the law need some discretion. In interpreting your legislation, you're going to need to have some discretion. And there's other ways that people can have discretion. But the way that that legal theorists and public law theorists kind of recognize that the way it should work is that generally you should have a fairly thick, a robust law that allows for discretion but encapsulates it. So the discretion is supposed to be the hole in the donut, and the donut is supposed to be law. So this is what it really ought to look like, how law ought to apply to humans. So I think that the circumstances on reserve, instead of being represented by like a box of donuts, where you've got your discretion is nicely encapsulated by robust laws that direct that exercise of discretion, just like a big old hula hoop. It's got a flimsy, plastic, sort of hollow sort of frame, and I would say that's the Department of Aboriginal or Indian Affairs Act that basically just gives the department jurisdiction over Indian affairs. That's all it does. It doesn't say how it's supposed to do it or not. And so it just opens up this massive area of discretion, which I think, which we require, this is what I'm arguing in one of my cases, is that somebody has to put some limits on what that exercise of discretion is. And we're actually waiting for leave to the Supreme Court of Canada in this case. And we've said, the feds don't want to legislate. The provinces, we just apply that law, but nonetheless, within that policy, there's so much room for abuse. And the common law or administrative law has to be able to provide some end limits around what they can or cannot do. Because right now, many people, I don't want to say all the staff at the department, but many people at the department kind of feel that they're unbounded almost. There's very little control over what they do, and very little oversight. And the Auditor General's report, again, goes back and says that same thing as well. It says the federal government has often developed programs to support First Nations communities without establishing a legislative or regulatory framework for them. Instead, the government has developed programs and services for First Nations on the basis of policy. As a result, the services delivered under these programs are not always well defined, and there is confusion about responsibility for funding them adequately. And so we certainly see that. And the Auditor General has also said that the lack of substantive legislative authority could undermine parliamentary control and accountability. Because if there was laws, then there would be that, there's a process when laws are passed, it goes to first reading, there's committees, there's some point where there's at least, in theory, some ability for our lawmakers to actually look at that. But that's never happened in the context of First Nations essential services. It was just a policy passed in 1964, and never since then has there been any real debate or discussion about what is adequate policy for First Nations on reserve. It's just instead these kind of default rules. So it precludes parliamentary debate on important questions. In addition, it does not provide an instrument for Parliament to hold the department accountable against program authorities beyond those approved by the Treasury Board. And these are some fairly old policies, as I've said, one's from 1964. Further, the Auditor General said the services available on reserve are often not comparable to those provided off reserve, but we've already looked at that to a certain already in this presentation. Here's the kicker for me, it's this last one. We believe that the structural impediments severely limit the delivery of public services to First Nation communities and hinder improvements in living conditions on reserve. And I think that's where I began, saying that I don't think we have this debate, or that most people in Canada don't even realize that this is what is significantly contributing to the circumstances of poverty on reserve. Certainly residential schools, colonialism, all of that certainly impacts and feeds into it. But these are real issues that we're not talking about, that could be changed, but we're not having that discussion about. So it's not just the historical impacts, it's government neglect in terms of legislation, it's government neglect in terms of proper funding. So my conclusion, I guess, is that although this is a number of historic and systemic causes for poverty and social problems in First Nation communities, the lack of adequate funding and legal frameworks for the provision of services on reserve is really exacerbating those problems. And I think it is holding First Nations communities back because of the poverty. And so I've added this recently. Some of you have seen the other previous presentation. What is the solution? And earlier I used to think that there was only one solution, but I think there's two solutions. And you'll forgive the crassness. But it's either that the government has to give a crap or it has to get out of the way. And when I mean give a crap, I mean that Canada and the provinces have to care enough to really want to be able to fix this problem. And they would have to do so in partnership with First Nations. So that is potentially working on legislation, whether it be federal or provincial, that does include First Nations and addresses their issues. Or maybe we don't want them to be involved because they've messed it up enough already. Maybe we just want them to get out of the way, which is to recognize that First Nations have the jurisdiction and are probably the best suited government to be able to actually deal with policy issues on reserve because they're in it and they're part of it, rather than these distant governments. And while recognizing that jurisdiction, also ensure that there's adequate and proper funding in order to ensure that there is successful self-governance, because you need the two, obviously. That's my presentation. Thank you.